So my name is Orla Feely. I'm Vice-President for Research, Innovation and Impact at UCD, and you're very welcome to this webinar. There's a huge amount going on in UCD, as you can imagine, in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've researchers working with our colleagues in the hospitals in areas such as testing and looking at how to treat the disease, looking at the mathematical modelling, the behavioural science, and all the many implications of the pandemic. So a huge amount going on in UCD. Of course, nobody more busy than my two colleagues here this evening, Professor Paddy Mallon and Professor Cillian de Gascun. Paddy Mallon is Professor of Microbial Disease in the School of Medicine in UCD, and he's also a consultant in infectious diseases at St. Vincent's University Hospital, where he does a lot of work in relation to COVID-19 and drug trials. And Professor Cillian de Gascun has become a very familiar face. He's the head of the National Virus Reference Laboratory, also at UCD, and he also chairs the expert advisory group to NPHET, the National Public Health Emergency Team. So I'm very grateful to both for giving of their very busy schedule to sit with us for 30 minutes or so this evening to answer some questions and to talk about their experience of the COVID-19 situation in Ireland. So Paddy, I might start with you. Can you tell me, how are things now in the hospital from your perspective? What's the situation?
So, Orla, thanks for inviting me on it, and I'd like to thank UCD Foundation and UCD Research for hosting this event. At the hospital, I think that from the COVID perspective, things are continuing to settle down, which is a really reassuring to see compared to where we thought we would be back in March when this was really starting to kick off. And it is, I guess, the hospitals are very much like the rest of the economy. We're trying to find ways to get back to normal. Like all businesses and all enterprises, we've a huge backlog of people that need to be seen and services that need to be reinvigorated again. So although we've less busy from the COVID point of view, a huge amount of activity going on trying to reconfigure how we're going to do services. And I think probably as with all industries, we're not looking to go back to the way that we were. We're trying to take this as an opportunity to innovate and try and streamline how we deliver services again, because we have probably more activity in a footprint that's the same or maybe a bit smaller, because now we have this new COVID disease that hasn't gone away. It's still there, but what we have to do is to try and operate the hospital within a footprint. So very busy time. Everyone is obviously reassured that the numbers coming down, but apprehensive that we need to be ready to scale back if we see a second wave coming through. So it is a really interesting time to live through.
And Cillian, from your point of view, how would you characterize the current situation?
Well, thanks for having me on this evening, and to the organisers. I suppose we've had such a difficult, I suppose, few weeks in the laboratories from a testing perspective that I think it's nice to be in a place where the laboratory capacity is no longer something that's restricting access to diagnostics for COVID-19. We're up at a situation now where we have the capacity to do at least 15,000 tests per day. As I said, we're not using that capacity at the moment. The challenge now, I think, is on the contact tracing side and getting results back to people and tackling that communication piece. And I suppose that's been a real eye-opener over the last few weeks about the different systems that have been set up. So a huge amount of work has been done by the HSE through the hospitals, HSE procurement in setting up community sampling hubs. We've set up a brand new testing system alongside the GPs and alongside the hospitals. The National Ambulance Service has been fantastic. And the problem was, I suppose one of the problems is that when you're linking up all of these systems, then at some point they have to all talk to each other. And in Ireland, just from, I suppose, years of underinvestment in IT, an individual health identifier, all of these things that seem so simple, trying to get across to the public that they're not actually in place. I think a lot of the public are used to watching medical dramas on TV and laboratory testing on TV and think that, you know, you get one blood sample and all of the tests are done and all the results are there. But thankfully, as I said, the laboratories are in a good place now. But coming back to one of the things Paddy said, we haven't been doing our routine diagnostic work, our routine laboratory work over the last 3 months. Really, we've put an awful lot of stuff on pause and trying to reintegrate that into the laboratory now with the same physical distancing constraints, because that's one of the challenges that we will face in the lab. Is we haven't had our full complement of staff in since the start of the pandemic for physical distancing reasons. So as we now start to see more activity in the hospitals and more samples coming back into the laboratories, trying to redefine the way we work in the lab is going to be really challenging as well. So again, we've noticed that our footprint in the NVRL on campus is really not fit for purpose anymore for something like this.
Yeah.
Now we've been talking with the university for a while about redeveloping that and moving towards a new model. But it's funny, our new model was likely to be a large open plan space, which maybe now is not suitable in a COVID world. So maybe our caution will be rewarded in some respects.
Yes, and the testing and the tracing, and you, as you described, we had to scramble to get this in position at the start of this pandemic, and things are now in a much better place than they were certainly in the testing. Are you happy that this is now robust, that this is going to be sufficient to support us going forward as we seek to navigate our way safely out of the pandemic?
So it's robust for the foreseeable future, but I suppose in medicine, I guess a lot of us now are looking towards winter. So if we can't take summer for granted, but if we do just park that for a minute, we're worried about what's going to happen in winter. We know that the pressure our system comes under with a normal influenza season. So we have to, I suppose, think about what that's going to look like and how we prepare for that. And again, if we see the demand increase across the globe for testing and for diagnostics, the supply chains we have, we're certainly in a better place than we were because there's more diversity in the hospital laboratories and in our own lab. A lot of us were pulling on the same supply chain at the start of all of this because the platforms were good and we were all using a similar extraction platform. So then the extraction kits became very highly sought after and in short supply. So we, thanks to the HSE, we've got a new platform from Roche in the NVRL. So that has freed up supplies for the hospital laboratories. But I think one of the impressive exercises or the impressive lessons from all of this was that by having a national coordinated approach, which we don't really have for supply chains, certainly within the laboratory system, has been really helpful because now the hospital laboratories and ourselves are pulling from different supply chains. So there is at least this contingency there. So it is certainly more robust than it was. But if the virus kicks off again, whether that's in the summer or later in the year, I suppose we can't be 100% certain, but we're certainly in a better place than we were before this all started.
And Paddy, back to the hospitals and the COVID part of the hospitals, what do we now know about the disease that we didn't know at the start of this? What are you seeing about its severity and its implications? And can you tell us a bit about the drug trials that you're involved in?
Yeah, so I guess we're realizing now that with all new infections that you pretty much take the textbook, rip it up and throw it away because you end up with these new diseases, discovering things about the diseases only as your experience flows. And we're realizing now that COVID, it's an infection caused by a virus, but the condition it causes is a real spectrum of disease. And you know, we heard initially that, you know, the majority of people get this flu-like illness, a small amount of people require hospitalization, and then an even smaller amount of people end up in ICU. But there's really more to it than that. We're seeing a lot of very unusual presentations. So we've seen people coming in with acute deliriums and psychoses. We've seen people coming in with pulmonary embolisms and people coming in with weird clotting abnormalities, people coming in with inflammation around their heart. So this whole the conventional wisdom that was out there about what way this disease presented has really just been thrown out. And similarly, this whole concept that the majority of people have a mild disease, what we're starting to see now in the COVID outpatient clinic that we've set up is that even people with mild disease are starting to come back in maybe 4 or 5 weeks down the track with significant ongoing symptoms that we reckon may be not related to the lung and not related to the virus, but actually related to an abnormal immune response. So there's a lot of this infection that we don't know about, but the signals that are coming through is that this is not a straightforward infection. And from that perspective, the one big takeaway that I've taken from that at a national strategy is this perception that in some way we can live with this virus and just have it rumbling along in the background, I really don't think medically that's a good idea, because we're going to be building up a large number of people with a large number of medical issues over time. So we need to be very careful about that. And we need to be taking whatever measures we can to get rid of this virus from our society, to try and avoid these unknowns. I mean, from the research perspective, I'm sitting in the Centre for Experimental Pathogen Host Research, or CEPHR, which is in UCD. This is a centre that was developed a couple of years ago, specifically growing from the research that we've been doing in UCD over the past decade. And it looks at the interaction between a pathogen, such as a virus, and the host. And we're almost unique in terms of the fact that we've developed close clinical links with the Mater Hospital and St. Vincent's Hospital. And on site, we have the technical expertise together with isolation facilities that do the full scope of research, going from very highly technical, high risk viral research and containment facilities right through to the clinical end and the clinical trial piece. And that's really paid off. We're ahead of the game internationally in that we had a lot of pre-developed clinical protocols that were ready to go that we adapted to COVID. We've recruited almost 500 individuals across the 2 hospitals that have provided a very rich biobank of samples that we're now starting to access. And we're able to compare that to years of biobanking in different diseases. So we almost have a unique opportunity here within that piece to look and try and understand exactly what this virus is doing as a disease to the human host. And alongside that, we have a very exciting clinical trials program. So there are only 4 clinical trials that are currently approved for COVID in Ireland. 2 of those have been developed from CEPHR in UCD. They're both hospital-based trials that are looking at the pre-ICU setting, so where the vast majority of people come in. And they're starting to kick off. We had the first kickoff meeting today at the Mater Hospital, with the second kickoff meeting tomorrow at St. Vincent. So that's really exciting. We're working on some really blue skies ideas, because now that COVID is moving out of the hospital, it's moving back into the community setting. And I think where the real value is going to be in this disease is preventing the disease. Now, obviously, there's a large amount of work going on in the vaccine world, and we're all really rooting and hoping that a vaccine is going to come off. But we need other contingencies. And within UCD, we've been working with colleagues around the world to look at very novel ways of using different types of medications in the community setting, where people are initially diagnosed, and trying to prevent onward transmission of the infection there. So it ties back into the Cillian's piece around the testing and contact tracing. We're working with our community health colleagues and with public health to try and, within that framework that the government's invested a lot of money in, be able to nestle in randomized clinical trials within that setting. And we're hoping to roll those out over the next couple of months. So an incredibly busy period, not just clinically, but also in the research field, an incredibly exciting couple of months ahead.
Yeah, and a huge amount to be done. And it's extraordinary to see the scientific and the innovation community around the world coming together as never before around a challenge of such a magnitude. So it'll be fascinating and so important to see what comes out of it. You talked briefly about vaccines there. Does either you have any views, any updates on what we're starting to see? We know it's incredibly early, of course, on that.
So I come from a background of research and clinical work in HIV. And for those of you who know about HIV, there is no cure, but there's been a huge amount of vaccine work. And over $1 billion has been invested in HIV vaccine work over at least the last decade. And there's 2 things that I learned from the vaccine work in HIV. First thing is, it's really hard to develop a vaccine against an RNA virus. Now, there are vaccines out there, but HIV is a virus that mutates very readily, and it's hard to vaccinate a virus that mutates. Coronavirus also has some of the same characteristics, so it's not going to be straightforward. The second thing is that vaccine researchers are the world's eternal optimists, because you cannot work in vaccine research without being an optimist. So every single little bit of good news that comes out of the vaccine world always tends to be over amplified. And unfortunately, I'm very used to seeing, good monkey results coming out, good phase 1 results coming out. But then when you actually get down to the phase 3 clinical trials, they end up being disappointing. So I guess that the hope is there. There's not a lot of novel stuff going on. The mRNA vaccine approach is a relatively new vaccine approach. And I think that the data that came out recently with the mRNA vaccine, I think is intriguing. You would hope that that sort of novel approach to vaccine development will be a bit different to the norm. The other thing that this disease presents a really good opportunity to look at is neutralizing antibodies. And that's where you actually look at someone who's developed an immune response to coronavirus, isolate that antibody and mass produce it. And really if coronavirus had happened 5 or 6 years ago, we wouldn't have been in a position to even think about this. But because of the increase in immunotherapies across medicine, the techniques have been really well defined. And already out of China, we have the first neutralizing antibody going into clinical trials. So I think that there's a huge amount of hope for novel engineering, novel biotechnology to provide an answer for this infection. Just how quickly that happens, I don't know.
Okay. And Cillian, on population antibody testing, either at a survey type level or else something that will be rolled out across the population, where are we on that now?
So at the moment we're evaluating, a number of hospitals and academic institutions are evaluating the antibody tests that have been released, recently come to market. From the point of view of the National Public Health Emergency Team, they've signed off on a public health-led seroprevalence study for SARS-CoV-2. So that's hopefully going to the Ethics Committee next week, the National Research Ethics Committee for COVID-19, with a view to starting enrollment in June. So that will be one part of it. It'll look probably at two distinct geographic situations, probably a high prevalence area and a low prevalence area, to get a feel for what's happening in people who maybe either weren't able to get a test, so they had symptoms but weren't able to get a test, or else they never had symptoms and maybe never realized that they had infection. And that will give us some idea. So that will be hopefully done for the first time in June, and then depending on the results of that, it will likely be repeated at serial intervals, so maybe a couple of times over the coming 12 months to try and see how that's changing over time. The one challenge with that, I suppose, is that it's always going to be limited by the size of the sample that you select. So it would be nice to look at other studies in, I suppose, different populations then as well, because obviously healthcare workers we've seen have been particularly hard hit in the course of this pandemic, and the nursing homes, meat processing workers. So we don't necessarily know definitively what the presence of antibody means in the context of protection, but at the same time, it might be useful information in the context of knowing how many have been exposed. But it comes back to, I suppose, the work that Paddy was talking about. There's a lot of information that we still have to learn around the duration of protection, whether reinfection can happen, and that's going to be very challenging again in the coming months. I think we would still like to know about the population at large. I think there'll be a lot of interest in this. I think people will be interested in knowing whether they've been infected. I think from a personal perspective, notwithstanding the fact that I work in a diagnostic laboratory, I think it would be nice to be able to make it available to the public if they want it. It has to be done in a controlled fashion, because I think if we don't do it properly, if people will order it online, they'll go to Amazon or whatever and order, home test kits. So we don't necessarily want to drive them into that area either. I think if it's done through the GP and if it's done, maybe it starts off with particularly vulnerable groups, for example, whether it's healthcare workers, whether it's people with who are on immunosuppression, or people who are about to undergo chemotherapy. I think there'll be a role for antibody testing in that sort of situation. I think one of the big things is that we don't use typically serology for the diagnosis of respiratory infection. So when we come to the winter, if people present with symptoms, it's I don't think it'll be the first test that we'll be doing, but it comes back again to what Paddy was saying. As we learn more about the disease and how the various manifestations, antibodies may well play a significant role in those individuals who maybe don't present with the classical, or what we thought were the classical respiratory symptoms. So it's certainly it'll also hopefully inform us over the coming months in the context of lifting restrictions and easing out of lockdown, because I think there's a concern, and I don't know if Paddy would share it as well, but there's a concern that maybe 5% of the population have only been exposed to this virus. So there's probably 90 to 95% of the population that remains susceptible, and the virus can kick off very quickly in that sort of environment based on what we've seen to date.
And that's the big question now, isn't it? There's a huge societal desire, a huge economic imperative to get ourselves back to some sort of normality, even if it is to be a new normality. What do we need to have in place before we can do that safely? Cillian, maybe you can kick off on that, and then Paddy, I'd like to hear your views as well on this.
So from a data perspective, in essence, we're looking at the straightforward things that the CMO is reporting every evening, the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations, the number of intensive care admissions, because we know that, so we spent a few weeks there with an average of 500 to 600 new cases per day. We know that if we get to 1,000 per day, that will probably overwhelm the hospital system. So what we want to do now is, having controlled it to a certain extent, we want to actively sort of track and trace every infection in the community. That's why the testing and tracing regimen was so important. And obviously the university, with the contact tracing centre over in the O'Brien Centre and the MVRLs, like UCD has been sort of to the forefront of that testing and tracing process. We've built up capacity that didn't exist in the country before, through our colleagues at Back Weston and Enfer. And again, we wouldn't have been able to do that without the university support. So it's been really impressive from public health, because it was colleagues, it was Pat Wall in public health that first put us in touch with Enfer and facilitated that whole development. So that's been really positive. But it is going to be really important that we continue to, that the public continues to observe the public health measures that have been put in place, and that we seek out and treat and identify as many cases as we can. And the challenge is, in recent months or sort of weeks, we've learned that in some respects it was straightforward if people had a flu-like illness. But the problem is now they don't have a flu-like illness. A large proportion will be asymptomatic, and a large proportion will have atypical symptoms. So trying to identify that cohort in the community is going to be challenging and will require some form of surveillance system, whether it's through GPs, whether it's through healthcare workers or various population groups. But that's the next challenge, I think, is trying to identify those cases that don't necessarily present with typical symptoms, or perhaps don't develop symptoms at all.
Paddy, what do you think is our most promising and safest route out of the current situation?
So from an infectious disease point of view, the safest way out of this is to get the virus out of the country. And the way to do that is to look at the characteristics of the virus. You know, the virus can only spread through physical contact. So the physical distancing thing really is key. And as people return to work, that physical distancing thing is going to need to remain until we can figure out if we've actually eradicated this from our environment. I think that the next thing is going to be the surveillance, because even if you look at the map of Ireland, a lot of countries around Europe are doing this. They're actually splitting the country into zones based on the prevalence of the virus within a particular country or county. And I think from a commercial point of view, that's going to be incredibly important, because if you see within a zone or within a county or a region that you're living that there has been, say, no cases for 2 to 3 weeks, that's a really encouraging sign in terms of how you can get commerce up and running again, and how you can start to function. And I think that surveillance piece requires testing, but it also requires that engagement of people to get tested. And that's the piece that really needs to be clearly messaged. We need to remove any disincentive there is to get tested. We need to make sure that it's rapid turnaround, so that if I wake up on a Monday and I want to go for a test, that I know I'm not going to miss 4 or 5 days of work waiting on a result back. So all of these things are going to be important in terms of commercial perspective. And then, like, economically, I think it's one of the big things here, the big lessons here, was the importance of research and the importance of the academic world in terms of response to these sorts of crises. So very early in the piece, I can remember emailing the president of UCD and asking for a sort of call to arms, nearly, from the point of view of trying to help us at the hospital level. And just the immediacy and the scope of that help was amazing. And you know, Cillian referenced some of the offshoots from that in terms of the connections that academia can give to you to provide innovation and provide solutions. And I think it's going to be that ability to be able to research and innovate is going to be key from an economic perspective in terms of industries getting back to how they work. And part of that's going to be innovative ways of working, innovative ways of surveilling what they put in place to make sure that what they're doing is working. And then that key about how you can integrate science, whether it be through PCR testing or whether it be through serology, especially for larger corporations. mitigate risk in terms of return to their workforce and return to normal duties is going to be key. And there's a massive opportunity there for industries and academia and universities to work together to try and find novel solutions as to how you manage that over the next few months.
And you talk there, Paddy, and I agree with you. It was remarkable to see the response from across the UCD community when you identify that need in the early stages. What is your current biggest need to deliver successfully on your activity now?
So our current biggest need is research investment. So we have the basis of a platform here to do something that very few places in Europe are able to do from a research perspective. And that's that platform that goes from the pathogen research right through to understanding the human host research, right through to the clinical trial research. And a lot of that has been built over years, and there's a lot of opportunity to make that grow and for us to become a world leader in that. And definitely be able to adequately prepare the country for the next pandemic, not only from a research perspective, but from a policy perspective and from a commerce perspective. But all of that does require investment. But I think that there is a key opportunity here and now for UCD to place itself at the very forefront of that, not only nationally, but at a European level. And a lot of the research that's going on within the field, even at a European and international level, is being led by investigators in UCD and in Ireland. So for example, Alistair Nicholl, who from Critical Care has been critically important in terms of international networks for ICU research. We're continuing to be involved from CEPHR's perspective in international collaborative research in this and other infectious diseases. So the basis in the platform is there for us to do something really special. And I think a level of investment or a level of interest at this stage could really make the difference.
And Cillian, for you, what do you most need at this point?
In essence, I suppose we need space, and laboratory space. I think like the National Virus Reference Laboratory has been based in UCD since 1963. I think it's a real success story. It's coming up on 60 years. But I think we've learned from this pandemic is that the laboratory space in which we're trying to provide a world-class service is too small in essence. And not really, as I said earlier, sort of fit for purpose. And I think there's an opportunity to come back to Paddy's point about preparing for the next epidemic, the pandemic. The university could have a world-class sort of 21st century laboratory on campus. And I think putting something like that in place that links closely with the hospitals and with the research side of infectious diseases and virology, I think that's really the challenge, because we have seen, we're using partners now in the private sector who have been great, but they have a core business that they will want to return to. So I don't know if they will be there in 6 months' time in winter, and that's a statement of fact. So obviously the hospitals have a finite capacity, but they've been great. But outside of that, in the community setting, it's really the NVRL plus a number of colleagues. So I think that's something that we would be looking at over the next, really, we can't even afford to wait for 2 years. You know what I mean? We've got to look over the next sort of 3 to 6 months to start developing that next plan so that UCD remains the focus for the NVRL for many decades to come. Because as I said, to my mind, I feel very fortunate to be director of the institution. And I think I just want to sort of to try and take it to the next level. And I think the pandemic has highlighted some of the deficiencies that are there through nobody's fault. It's a laboratory that is built up sort of piecemeal over the year. And I think it will be great to see it sort of take the next step and become a centre of excellence, sort of physically as well as scientifically.
Yeah, and certainly UCD would be very supportive of that. I'm very impressed by the way that neither of you said your biggest need was a holiday, which I suspect is probably the case. Final quick question to both of you. We've all in our lives, in our work, learned so much that has startled us and struck us over this period. What has struck you, maybe surprised you over this period? Paddy, maybe you first.
I think the biggest thing that surprised me is the country that we're living in and the society that we're living in. Everything that we have to thank for from a hospital perspective, we have to thank for every individual in the country. And if anyone had said in January that Irish people would be able to do what they did 2 days before St. Patrick's Day, you would have been laughed out. And I think that it's a testament to a generation of focus on education and a learned community. That, you know, we have a group of people that are very well educated, that got this very quickly, and it was their actions that really saved us from a catastrophe. And I think that will stay with me for a long time.
And Cillian?
Yeah, no, Paddy's still my answer. So, I'm as a virologist, I'm fascinated by the virus. You know, like SARS tried this in 2003, didn't succeed. MERS tried it in 2012, didn't succeed. This virus has come in the space of, 5 months now, and has achieved a level of success from a virology perspective that is, I won't say it's unprecedented, but in our lifetime, it's unprecedented from the point of view of the severity of disease that it causes, the way it's transmitted, the speed at which it's transmitted across the globe, and just the various manifestations of disease that Paddy talked about earlier. It is, you know, it's not just another common cold virus. It's not just another influenza virus. So to me, that's been really striking. But it's back to Paddy's point. The most impressive thing has been the societal response. There's obviously frustration out there with the sacrifices they've made over the last few weeks. Like, if you think back, who amongst us here, looking back to say Christmas Day or New Year's Eve, would have thought 5 months on, this is the situation that we'd be living in.
Yeah,
it's really incredible.
It is, yes. So thanks so much on that note to you both. Thanks obviously for all your work, for all that you and your teams are doing, and thank you for giving of your time and your expertise so generously this evening. It's been enormously interesting and informative. We've a few other events coming up within UCD. We've got various webinars of this type arranged. I'll just tell you one or two that I'm going to be involved in. A week from today, the 27th of May, we're going to have another webinar with Peter Doran and Liam Gallagher. Peter heads up our Clinical Research Centre in UCD in St. Vincent's, based in St. Vincent's Hospital, and also Liam Gallagher, the director of the Conway Institute in UCD. So that'll in some sense follow on from what we've been talking about here with Cillian and Paddy. With UCD alumni, I'm going to be having a chat with Sir Ciarán Devan, who's formerly CEO of Macmillan Cancer Support, CEO of the British Council, now chair of the board at the HSE, a UCD engineering graduate like myself. That's scheduled for Thursday, the 11th of June. And this coming Saturday, as part of the UCD Festival, Saturday, the 23rd of May, we have a great event. Tony Houlihan, the Chief Medical Officer, is going to be answering questions from children about the coronavirus and COVID-19. So all great events, and I hope that maybe some of you might be able to join us for those. But for now, thank you very much for your time. Thanks in particular to Paddy and to Cillian, and we'll see you again. Thank you.